You'll find it in an amazing way that you didn't see the first slide. It's the story from the beginning.
Yes.
When you first thought about
yes.
It's really it's your life story since that time. Since that time, and sort of process through and amazing. Well, I think your determination to do it, no matter what you say, it's just the life story.
Yes.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. Adrian Gale has very kindly agreed to act as chairman and to introduce Peter Palumbo. But before he does so, I would personally like to thank Peter very much for coming and to say that, as you all know, the general purpose of these evenings is that they should be conversations about the subject of quality generally. And in that context, I don't think we could have a better guest than Peter Palumbo. So thank you very much for coming, Peter. So I'll hand you over to you again.
I think we are indeed fortunate. Peter's agreed to come at very short notice. I don't think he's ever done this sort of thing before, and so both he and I are new boys in the sense that I am new to this to this gathering, but I understand it is at any rate the first time that a patron, and after all there was that excellent booklet that you produced some years ago talking about patronage. I think it is the first time that in our midst we've been fortunate enough to have a patron, and I think it is remarkable, particularly in this instance, because there's a patron who quite clearly has dedicated himself to quality. And it seems to me unlikely that any scheme has ever been put before the public or to any authority such as the City Corporation or to various thresholds of opinion such as the Royal Fine Art Commission with such amazingly wide and detailed documentation, so that every effort has been made to demonstrate what impact and what improvements and what really, in a sense, to open, if you like, the conversation about the qualities of this proposal by the documentation that's being prepared. And of course, initially, this started with the legacy, if you like, from Mises' office, which has been carried on by the executive architects here in the form of Peter Carter and Dennis Menina and Frank Sturr, who from Helford's office, who is not unfortunately able to be with us. I can only just say that, I mean, Peter, having known him now for 20 years, I mean, has just impressed me more than anything else about the scheme is that of his determination to do it above all else, and his utter conviction that the architect he selected to do the job was the right man to do it. And one is caught up, I think, almost in a crusade of the middle of this century to demonstrate, I mean, which is a demonstration, it seems to me, of a building in the centre of a city of quality. And Peter is going to tell the story. Peter Palumbo, thank you very much.
When AD asked me to do this, my first inclination was really to demur, because I hadn't done a talk like this before. And then when he told me who was going to be present, my next reaction was really to run for the hills. But in the end, of course, I said to him that it would be a great pleasure and a privilege to do this if he understood that I hadn't got time and didn't want to anyway make a set speech or even write notes, and that I would just say a few words, and you would have to, and he and you would have to forgive the ums and the ers and the rather disjointed nature of the whole thing. But if you were prepared to accept that, I was delighted to do it. Mansion House Square, looking back on it over 23 years, which I realised a couple of weeks ago is exactly half my lifespan, rather a daunting thought, came about really as a combination of circumstances and luck. Circumstances in the sense that I was very fortunate to come into and then inherit a business that had a very strong financial base. A financial base that had, for example, a very low gearing ratio between debt and assets. It's always been, as a family policy, around about 20%. And if I have my way, as I hope I shall, in the very near future, that ratio will be reduced to about 10%. And so the result of that has been that we've been able to lock up huge amounts of capital, as you can imagine, for long periods of time, yielding perhaps 1.5–2%. And we've been able to take that, we've been able to accommodate that situation. I think that had it been a public company, for example, with a lot of shareholders and so on, that would have been impossible, because shareholders ask questions and they want to know why their money is not being used to better effect, and why there are no more tangible results, and so on and so forth. So that was the first thing, the financial base, which was very solid and still is. The second factor, I think, was really one of luck, because I was very fortunate to be exposed at an early age to a very enlightened man at school, a housemaster, who had an encyclopedic knowledge, was very sensitive culturally, and took us right through the whole gamut, this was age 16, of artistic endeavour, and artists from Giotto and Piero della Francesca on one hand, to Delft pottery on the other, and to Mondrian, and to Matisse, and to Sullivan, and to Behrens, and to Frank Lloyd Wright, and ultimately to Mies. And it was when we got there that, in a way, it was curious, because this was in 1951. It was the year after, just after the Farnsworth House had been built, and so one was able to see it in reproduction, really for the first time, in its pristine condition. And that really struck me as being one of the great structures of our time. And I always remember that when one always has personal memories of things that really hit you hard in the solar plexus, and this was certainly one of them for me. Chartres and other buildings, of course, were equally impressive in a different way. So that was fortunate. I mean, I had no idea, of course, age 16, that I would ever come to grips with Mies, let alone own the Farnsworth House, or endeavour to build Mansion House Square. But somewhere along the line, I suppose, those things must have rubbed off. And when I came into the business, which I did in 1958, one of the first things that came on my desk was an investment in the heart of the City of London, just a stone's throw from the office. And purely as an investment, and because we happened to have some spare money about, no thought of development whatsoever, I bought it. It was in Bucklesbury, and it set off, as it happened, a pattern of events that led ultimately to the accumulation of the site. Others gradually came my way, and there began to emerge this possibility of a development. The question then was, who should one go to as an architect? And two names sprang to my mind. The first, of course, was Mies, and the second was Lord Holford in terms of town planning. Lord Holford was easy to approach, and he was sympathetic, and he gave encouragement. Mies was a god to me. I mean, he'd been a god for many years, and I simply didn't know how to approach him, apart from the obvious way of writing to him, which I did, saying, "Dear Professor, I have this site, potentially a great site in the middle of London, and would you think of, and I've been a fan of yours, and would it be possible, and might I have your thoughts on it? And I got a cable back saying, very happy to see you next Monday morning at 10 o'clock. So out I flew to Chicago in 1962 and met Mies, which was a great event for me, and told him the problem. I told him in 1962 that the building was unlikely to be built before 1987 because of the leasehold problems. And he said, well, how far do you want me to go with it? And I said, well, I want you to go all the way. And he said, well, do you want the inside done as well as the outside? I said, yes. And so that was the basis on which we went forward in full knowledge of the architect that he would not live to see the building built. It would essentially be posthumous architecture. And at the end, he said to me in 1968, I have gone as far as I can possibly go. I can go no further. This is the simplest, this is the ultimate that I'm able to achieve at this time. He said, if you asked me in 40 years' time, could I do something different? The answer might be yes, because technology would enable me to do things that I can't do today. But he said, for the next 40 years, there is no improvement that I can see that I could do other than the design that I've come up with. So the design was then fully prepared, the drawings were prepared, and we then held an exhibition at the Royal Exchange. Some of you may have seen it already.
Did he come to London at that time?
He came to London twice, yes. He came on a private visit, and then he came in October of 1967. And all sorts of people say, well, you know, Mies never came to London. He just sent this building out on a well-tried formula to fit in with the Chicago grid or the Dallas grid or the Toronto grid or something. In fact, he came to London, he saw the GLC, he saw the City Corporation, he lunched at Lloyd's Bank. It was an interesting lunch because I don't know, perhaps they do it every time, I don't think they do, but the chairman and directors of Lloyd's Bank were lined up at the doorway to meet him, a whole lot. Anyway, Lloyd's Bank were then going to occupy the building, and he was made much of, quite rightly. So this was the general pattern of things. We had this exhibition at the Royal Exchange. It was enormously successful in 1969. We had a 12-day exhibition. It was visited by 33,000 people. We got a 70% vote of approval for the scheme in general, which was enormously high. People were given comment cards, and we tried to do it as well as we possibly could. And then the scheme ran into trouble. It ran into trouble because of the sort of stop-go attitude or legislation, which for 3 years prohibited any building at all. This office development permit in 1965. We overcame that. It took us 3 years to overcome it. No sooner did we overcome that than there was further legislation, and really, I think this is one of the key problems, that one can never really foresee what is going to happen. One is always at the mercy of legislation. It can hold things up for 3, 5, 7, 10 years. It's almost meaningless. Anyway, that's all part of the game and part and parcel of the exercise, and one must accept it. I'm certainly not complaining about it. the situation now is that planning permission, as you know probably, was applied for on the 31st of December last. The scheme is now being formally considered by the city and by other authorities. And I believe that the ultimate conclusion will be a public inquiry. We're waiting to hear at the moment. Meanwhile, we go on endeavouring to influence opinion, if we can, for this particular project. Now, I know that it is not a perfect project, and Monica Pidgeon said to me just before this talk began that she admired my persistence, and I rather liked that, I must say, because most people use the word obsession, which I don't care for. I think persistence is much better. I think that obsession somehow implies, or perhaps even presupposes, an inflexibility of attitude, some form of uncompromising approach, which I hope that I don't have. I know the weaknesses of the scheme. I have never denied that there are other approaches, architectural approaches to it, perhaps equally valid to the approach that Mies adopted. What I do think is that I have tried to pursue an idea that I thought was right in the 1960s. I've agonized over it, and I've debated it with other people and in my own mind since, and it still seems to me relevant today. And that seems to me the big question: is it relevant? Is it relevant in terms of efficiency? Is it relevant in terms of appearance? Is it relevant in terms of what it does to the surrounding buildings? Is it relevant in all sorts of ways that we never really thought about in the 60s? Energy conservation, wind tunnel tests, pollution, and all these sort of issues that are now very much in the air. And it seems to me that on every count, the building and the conception are as relevant today as they were then. So I don't in any way discount other people's solutions, but I just think that mine is equally good and perhaps better than most.
Would this be the moment to run through the slides?
I think
Or
it
would you like to
would,
talk to the slides if we had the lights down?
if we
I mean,
could-
what do you think? And,
Yes.
and then you could...
turn them off.
And do you have a pointer?
Do you stay?
I don't.
This is this is a wonderful photograph of Mies taken by Monica Pidgeon that came to light a couple of weeks ago, and we think she can't quite remember, but we think it's Mies in a London pub, in 1959. And it really gives the lie to people who say he didn't come to London at all. When I first met him in 1962, I was very, very nervous, almost as nervous as I am tonight. And he said, well, how's the Balaga building in London? And I said, well, I'm sorry, I didn't know there was a Balaga building. Oh, yes, he said, it's in Berry Street. You should look at it sometime. It's a very good building. And so Mies knew a great deal about London, I think, and I think this is certainly the best photograph I've ever seen of him, and it really says a great deal about him. Next. This photograph on the right of the Farnsworth House, of which I'm the proud owner, would really set the whole thing off for me in 1951, and it's been a constant source of inspiration and a refuge, really, of serenity in times of stress. The picture on the left, again, was one that I saw my first exposure to Mies in the flesh soon after it was built in 1958. the Seagram building in New York, looking out as it does across the plaza area and across Park Avenue to the Rackets Club. And I think that if one wants the most telling parallel between this building in New York and ours in London, our proposed building in London, is this relationship between the Mies building and the Rackets Club and the Mies building and the Mansion House, as it would be across the plaza. Next. These slides were taken in 1968 at the exhibition we had at the Royal Exchange, and they show John's marvellous photo montage in black and white in those days. The one that we had at the Guildhall the week before last was in colour, equally brilliant, and the idea obviously is to endeavour to project the feeling that the square would give. It was a wonderful moment that Peter Carter was telling me about the other day, and I remember it when he refreshed my memory. Suddenly, at one point, this lady here brought out her sandwiches and began eating, as she might do in the square itself. And the slide on the right shows a mock-up of the mullion and the spandrel and the bronze and the tinted bronze glass against the Royal Exchange. Rather an interesting contrast. Next. This slide on the left tries to emphasize that really these proposals are nothing new. That Christopher Wren proposed a square for this area following the Great Fire in 1666. After him, John Evelyn, and later still Robert Hooke, and later still, and many years before he met Mies, Lord Holford himself, all proposed squares, open spaces for this area. This is our proposal on the lower section. And the slide on the right tries to give some indication of the character, the colour, the range of activity that could be utilised and form part of the square if it was properly programmed in the future. Next. Here again, this is a layout of the site plan in rather greater detail. The building, as you'll see, on the extreme western edge of the site, occupying 22% of it. Queen Victoria Street diverted from its present straight course into the Bank intersection and diverted round to the left in front of the building where it joins Poultry, about 100 yards from Bank intersection. The surrounding buildings of St Stephen Walbrook of 1672, Mansion House of 1739, the building by Sir Edwin Cooper on the corner, which is the National Westminster Bank headquarters of 1929, and the Lutyens building, the Midland Bank headquarters of 1936, and our proposed building of our time. The slide on the right takes you into and past the portico at the north portico of the Mansion House, and shows in a way the disposition of the square from the other view, looking west, the way the traffic would circulate, and the relationship between the Mansion House and our proposed building. Here again, we have a ground level plan, which I don't think needs any great explanation from me. The shopping, of course, which we'll come to in a minute, is underground. The slide on the right takes us closer into the square. You can see, for example, the main access to the concourse below, and an indication of the landscaping which continues round to the left by Lanning Roper. This is a beautiful section, I think, looking north, and drawn by Dennis Menina, and it shows the mansion house on the extreme right, hardly visible, the National Westminster Bank, the Midland Bank, and our building. It shows, I think it shows.
I'm trying to get it to show.
Yes.
Leave it at that, I think.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
Well, it shows the shopping underneath and the access to it from the square, and there's further access from the building and various other points in the square. It shows the relationship of the shopping concourse to the travelator down, those two tubes down below, the travelator and the steps. It shows the National Safe Deposit, which I own, on the right, going with a famous flooded chamber underground, and which we want to keep. Not because it's a great money spinner, it is not, but simply because it's a really very beautiful example of, remarkable example of late Victorian industrial design. And this slide on the right was John's huge photo montage at the Guildhall exhibition, and was the updated version of the black and white one we had in 1968. Next, please. Here we see on the left, down. Here we see on the left the relationship between our proposed building and the soffit of the Lutyens building. The strange, I think, I think that there's much in common between the two buildings in terms of proportion, in terms of this classical order, and in terms of the depth in which one is able to see into the buildings. I mean, see right through our building, but when one looks at the Lutyens building, one sees that has tremendous depth as well. Also shows the new course of Queen Victoria Street to the left in front of the building. The slide on the right is an interesting one. It shows the shopping concourse with the linkage on the right to Bank Station. There's a direct link to the subway system, and access, as you can see, from various points in the building and around the square. The one thing I think that Mies was very keen about and very anxious was that the shopping itself should be a direct reflection in terms of quality to the building above it. And all sorts of people say to me, well, this shopping element, this retail element, is simply a postscript to the development as a whole. What you're out to achieve is simply a big office building, and from which you'll make a great deal of money, and the shopping really can go to hell. This is absolutely not true. I mean, Mies spent a great deal of time on this. The materials to be used will be as rich as those above ground. That's to say, the shops will have bronze shop fronts. There will be marble and granite used. The detailing will be as precise and the proportions as good as those above ground. Next, please. This is a shot taken from the model itself, and it shows that I think it really gives the lie, in my opinion anyway, to those people who say that this view of the mansion house, the western flank of the mansion house, is really rather a pathetic thing and should not be exposed to public view. It's, I believe, rather a monumental thing, and suffers no disadvantage by being fully revealed. Next.
Coming.
These photographs are almost identical. They are sort of before and after. The one on the left shows the skyline from Waterloo Bridge, and the one on the right has the same view but with our building in it. Shows the impact of the building from Waterloo Bridge. This was a technique that Mies used in all his projects, and it's one that we've tried faithfully to follow in the interests of accuracy as much as anything else, but also to demonstrate quite clearly the impact of the building on the panorama of the skyline, and also, as you'll see from the following slides, upon rather sensitive views, or what are considered sensitive views. Here the one on the left is taken from the roof of St Paul's, and the one on the right is taken from, of course, the same view, same vantage point, with the building again as a photo montage element. Next, please. This one, I think, speaks for itself. It's taken from the Royal Exchange, from the roof of the Royal Exchange, and it shows the proposed change. This is a view from Cornhill, looking westwards, down Cornhill on the left, and the same view with the building as proposed. Next. This is a shot taken looking east, down Queen Victoria Street on the left, with the National Westminster Tower in the background, and again our building superimposed. This is a very sensitive building, a very sensitive view of the beautiful steeple of St Mary le Bow, with our building as proposed on the right. This is going to give cause for, and does give cause for, great concern. I personally feel that the backdrop of the bronze will be rather beautiful against the Portland stone of the steeple. And in fact, the incumbent of St Mary le Bow, Gerald Hudson, who was lunching the other day, when he saw that, he said, well, I must immediately get the steeple cleaned, because that's going to be I can't have a pristine building on one hand and my steeple looking dirty on the other. Will you clean it for me? This is our latest effort at Guildhall a couple of weeks ago, for which Adi was entirely responsible, and he did a fantastic job because we only had 3 weeks in which to do it, to set it up. The slide on the right shows the materials, the bronze section, the tinted glass, the travertine marble in the back, sitting on the flame-finished granite square. Next, please. More shots again. That's the big photo montage in the background, with the tilting model in the foreground, right, showing the building as it would appear in the... We took a square mile. We took the square mile of the city, and we've almost completed, as you can see. It shows the impact of the building, of the proposed building, on the city as a whole, and there's not much more to say about that.
Is that the floor model on the right?
That's the floor model on the right. The floor model, we had a typical floor model made, which you can see rather indistinctly on the right. But it's interesting because it shows that each floor only has in fact two columns that protrude into the space. The rest is clear space, and a degree of efficiency of 77%. Next, please. Again, photographs from the Guildhall exhibition. We had several wonderful moments. One of them was where I was talking to a lady, and she was quite a humble soul, but perhaps I explained myself very badly. But she, when she left, when we began the conversation, she was rather much against the development, but then she sort of came round to it. And in the end, when she left, she said to the commissioner at the door as he opened it for her, "Could you tell me the way to get to Mansion House Square, please?" Which was a marvellous moment. Next, please.
That's the end, Peter.
Oh, that's the end.
That's nice.
Do you want to say any more?
No, I try and answer any questions, I think.
Well, Peter, thank you very much. Listen, sit. It's your turn to sit. You've been on your feet.
I think, the sort of unfolding of this extraordinary story, in the end, boils down to the process through which we are all bound to forge our way in getting a building which is, in a sense, extreme in any way, constructed, getting it built. And the thing that interests me very much, and as how I'd like to see, maybe we could start this conversation, is really, how best is it possible that one projects a scheme which, after all, is only a projection in the sense that you rely on graphic means, models, film, as in Peter's case, because he had this film made, and I'm sorry you can't see that. Really putting in front of everybody as much evidence as possible, but there are these various formal thresholds over which you have to go. And the interesting thing is how consents work. To Americans, they're incredulous when they learn the process through which we have to go to achieve the fruition of any exercise like this. And and it has been, as it were, the unfolding of this, which I think is something of this exercise, which in Peter's case has been taking place over a considerable period of time, and has been done with great precision and a great exactness. At very short notice, I said to Richard it would be good if he could just say something about the kind of process that he had to go through, and indeed is going through again on Coin Street, and what his view is. There must, I believe, be a more satisfactory way of doing it than the way in which we go about it. I think there seems to me a case for having some kind of authority of London, which is, I think, of a rather different nature than the one we have at the moment. I think London is such a problem. There should surely be a Ministry of London, but in a way that's a different question. But I would perhaps, we could just start, Richard. I don't know if you could just say a word about, your experience of this process and where you think we might be able to improve it.
With using the excuse that I've only just been told, I'd like to change what you asked me to talk about. It's just that I think there's a certain danger. It happened, I felt a little bit last time when I was here, that we shall all end up by sort of crying on each other's shoulders. I think there's lots to cry about. Perhaps we could come back, though, if you don't mind, come back later to crying on each other's shoulders and see whether we could actually perhaps talk for a moment about the me as building. I can obviously there are tremendous problems. I can clearly see the problems, and the number one problem is our own amazing mistakes that we've done over the last 50 years, and the total lack of confidence which I think we have at the moment, which I don't believe will lead to better buildings or better environment. but I can see, as Peter himself has said, a whole series of problems in relation to this site, this city, and all the things that I certainly have talked about in relation to, let's say, noise. In other words, the feeling that in English buildings are seldom seen front on, the fact that squares are foreign to the city, rather foreign. I mean, each time I have to say it. The fact that one is looking towards an architecture today, possibly of which would of greater interest, legibility, perhaps, in the sense that you should not be able to read it once, but you should have reading upon reading. That in urban context terms, there are points of pivot, there are points of relaxation, there are points of pedestrian, there are points of vehicle. I mean, buildings tend to be more plastic in relation to that. In response to what? In response probably to the rotten buildings, many rotten buildings we've had, as well as very few good ones, which pretend to be Miesian in their roots. And then I have to evaluate, having said all the fact that I think it is a complicated problem and the site is difficult, then I have to ask myself a whole series of questions, such as, what is the actual quality of the building that we're looking at? And I obviously can't back and have to say, the quality of the building that we're looking at in the terms of what has happened in the last 50 years is probably the best building that Londoners will have seen. If it isn't in the best, it must be somewhere in the best too. And I can't think which the second one is at the moment, but I mean it's up there somewhere. Then I have to say to myself, okay, so it's a fantastic building. And then I say to myself, okay, it's a fantastic building with a great architecture, with a great tradition, who's put up rather few bad buildings. Unlike some of the other masters of architecture. And then I have to say to myself, and who is the client? And is he as the patron, or is he someone who is in for a quick financial return? Well, I have no doubts about that. I've known Peter for some time. I worked with him, not in architecture. He's precise. He has tremendous integrity. The thing which Mies had, I think that's actually a tremendous linking thing, integrity. Both are out for something which I think is absolutely unique in my experience. Only occasionally do you come across it. I mean, I've just had a few clients who are very interested in it, which is really quality, rather than the fast buck. And then I have to say to myself, is it valid today? And I've heard a hell of a lot of stuff, about what is not valid today. It's made of glass. And then I have to ask myself, well, does that mean that if Foster's Ipswich building was going to be built today, I would say, let's have it all concrete. And it's not as simple as that. I mean, first of all, of course, you can't just say it is no longer valid today because it's glass and there's an energy crisis, or because we know something more about, Bureau Mansion after all, planning. It's not Bureau Mansion, but I'm just taking these things. Actually, the validity of the building goes beyond that. It is certainly usable today. It's certainly lots of buildings are going up like that and nowhere near as good as that. So you can't say it's not valid today in terms of use, I believe. As to what's on the site, there are some mediocre buildings with some good spaces in between, the negative spaces between the buildings which exist are certainly one of the most exciting single element and the most difficult problem to see destroyed. Having said that, I'm also quite convinced that the alternative is not a re-life of the early 20th century in the sense of the use of those buildings, but it's actually a gutting of those buildings. And when I see what has just happened, God help us all, Billingsgate, which I was involved in, and where we fought to retain Billingsgate, and I note that it has been retained, but all that's been retained is the first 6 feet all the way around, and then you've got an office block in the middle of it. If that's what retention means, God help us all, let's pull it down. There's nothing left. It's sort of, architecture and architects at their absolute worst. So if that's the sort of plight that it's like to have in this area, and if it's because of its age, because it really is out of date in the sense of that it's run down to such a way that it would need a tremendous, again, intelligent, sensitive plan to to make those buildings live again. I'm not even sure it's possible. I doubt it. Anyhow, it comes to the same problem as in the sense of the site, as all those people who say to me, well, I love the Mies building, or I love whatever it may be. Maybe it's Bobo, but I wish it wasn't there. I mean, perhaps it could be somewhere else. All these people who say, if it only was somewhere else, I feel such an absolute non-situation. Of course it's not somewhere else. I mean, it's there. I mean, God damn it, it's like saying, I wish, St. Paul's was somewhere else. I don't understand the question. It's not somewhere else. It is there. That's what we have to deal with it. And the question of it is, it's not there. It's not going to be anywhere else. And all the rest are excuses which we sort of try to hang our hat on, such as you have it both ways. Again, I've shown about the lack of confidence. You can either have it, if the ideal world is, put it in somebody else's garden. I mean, put it somewhere else, but not in my little plot. As far as the future is concerned, well, I think that if we don't build it, our sons and our grandsons will have every right to kick us for it. They won't care two hoots about the problems that we're dealing with at the moment. And the problem that the architect has did, of course it would be better to have built it straight away. Having said that, I can think of a very large proportion of Italian churches which I could go through, which were all built after the architect was dead, and I haven't noticed, and seldom heard sort of learned organisations saying what a pity they weren't built. In general, of course, it's better if they're built. But in this situation, we have one exceptional, unlike many of Alberti or Brunelleschi's buildings, we have one exceptional thing. We have a full set of drawings, both for the exterior and the interior. That is a pretty exceptional situation. Plus, the client who appeared to has appointed an organisation who is working with an organisation who I believe is totally capable of building it, who worked with me, since Peter Carter, and who knows the ins and outs of that problem. I had a wonderful dinner with Peter Carter, with Peter Palumbo and Charlie Jenks and Norman Foster. We practically sort of threw bottles at each other at the end of it. In a sense, I suppose I hope that we get some of it today, in which I guess it was Charlie Jenks for surely we can do something post-modernist, and not the fact that there, Norman and I saying, well, surely if we put a building up there of that quality, it'll show the lie to all those second and third-rate buildings which keep on going up, which pretend to be Mies. And I, for one, would like to come out here quite clearly on the side of having it there.
Thank you, Richard.
Can I ask about the square? That's also within your sort of provenance, isn't it? The square itself.
Yes, I would construct the square and then dedicate it to the corporation.
Because I was in Tel Aviv the other day, and there they have two lovely squares which are full of people all the time, but they're related, one of them to a museum and the other one to an auditorium, a concert hall and a theatre. And I just sort of think it would, I came back to England thinking we haven't got any squares that are full of people. It would be nice if we had. And I was thinking about your square and wondering what people would come to it. And at night, nobody would come to it, would they? Because there's nothing happening at night.
Well, you're quite right, there isn't
anything. But what
anything.
people would come in the day?
Well, I think that it is, first of all, in the focal, in the very heart of the city. And it's linked to the subway system, as I said. It is crossed and recrossed many, many thousands of times a day by many, many thousands of people coming up from Cannon Street, going down Poultry, coming down Threadneedle Street, going down Queen Victoria Street, converging,
crossing at the corners,
and would inevitably have to go underground. But apart from that, I think that, you see, it does offer a form of ceremonial for the Mansion House, a framework for ceremonial for the Mansion House, which the Mansion House has never had. The present arrangements are pitiful. Last year, for example, my office overlooks the back of the Mansion House, and the area became so congested during a visit of a head of state that he was sort of rushed round the back under an umbrella in the rain. I mean, there was nowhere that his car could draw up, and that sort of shameful arrangement, I think, ought properly to cease. The other thing I feel about it is that it's a little bit difficult to defend this one, because I don't really know what the answer is, but my hope would be that perhaps we could effect some sort of spin-off for the Barbican Arts Centre, and so that we could organise in the evenings, at night, concerts on that area. I mean, it's 70 yards by 50, it's quite a large area.
In the square.
In the square. We could organise concerts, we could organise theatre, open air or in a marquee of some kind. We could organise exhibitions and so on, so that the life of the area would not cease at 5:30 when everybody goes home. The shops would stay open, they would be patrolled, they would to stop vandalism and all that sort of thing, and there would be perhaps cinema, whatever, on the space above. Dancing, I don't know.
I think there are certainly many people going there. I mean, there's no question that you are going to get that flow of people, I would have thought. But one of the things that bothers me is the fact that wind tunnel tests, I don't know, maybe they're much better now, but we've had this argument so often that the thing's been through a wind tunnel test, then it's built, and then the place is unusable because of despite all the assurances that there wouldn't be any unpleasant effects. There are unpleasant effects, and one can think of many places in London where one was assured that there wouldn't be any unpleasant effects, and there now are, and one doesn't like sitting there because of that. The theory, I think, behind that, very basically, is that London has got isolated towers on the whole, and therefore there aren't enough to take the wind right up, so it never comes down again, which is more or less what happens in New York. Now, I don't know what the answer to that one is, whether you now feel confident that it's actually going to work or not. But if you can't get the wind up so it doesn't come down again, then it's going to come down.
All I can say is that we've been to the best people that we could possibly go to in Oxford and in Bristol, who are prepared to come and support us at an inquiry, if there should be an inquiry, and whose findings can be challenged at that time. We're lucky, I think, in this respect, that the prevailing wind comes from the southwest. If it came from the northeast, if it came down past the Royal Exchange and hit the building full on, then you would get a high degree of turbulence, because the building would act as a barrier and it would so on. But the wind actually comes in 90% of the time from the Thames, and up that way it goes past the building.
But then, in fact, the unbearable part would be to the southwest of the building, and that's where the building would catch the air.
The building would catch the air at the
your little garden.
No, the little garden would be shielded from that. Yes, well, that would be as it is at the moment.
Yes.
That would be as it is the little water garden.
I think while to look at the problem as sort of pure architecture, I think almost everybody here, really would welcome the idea of a serious, marvellous, modern building of this kind, because we desperately need some demonstration that it is possible. See, all the ones we have, like the Commercial Union building, are bloody awful. There's no getting away from that. They have a kind of thin cheapness about them which is totally revolting. And although the spatial quality of the space that's in front of the Commercial Union is actually suspiciously like the one in front of York building, and is bloody awful, windswept and never used, it is a total disaster in relation to the city. Now, the city is, I work quite a lot in the city, and it is, as you said at the beginning, it's a very special place, and you obviously know it well and understand it. That's what's, anyway, there's sort of poignancy there, which we might examine. You see, the essence of the city is the sort of narrow streets and the tiny little areas and the tiny scale. One of the buildings I actually value most in London is the Belcher little building which you're going to take down. And I actually used it once in a book as against Bucklersbury House, because there's a wonderful photograph of it in relation to Bucklersbury House, which shows a kind of, the new barbarism actually treading over the last bit of the city. It's actually a perfect illustration of it. Now, you're actually going to expose Bucklersbury House, which must be the most awful, bloody awful building that's ever been built, in my opinion. And that, admittedly, it's exposed all a little more. It's not going to do any harm. But, I mean, even if one cased it for something, it would be an enormous improvement. But I think the real problem is the scale. Because you've got what is in effect two major roads running by. And Queen Victoria Street is by no means untrafficked. And Poultry is quite a big road as well. So that the square is not a protected square. There's heavy traffic on two sides. And one of the things I had originally hoped was that one might somehow wiggle the roads onto at least one side only, so that you'd have the thing in relation to the squares as the secret building is. You see whether there is a real sense of protection in relation to the building itself, and the relationship to the building opposite is actually very beautiful. The trouble with the Seagram building, and with your buildings too, of course, is that the relationship on the sides has gone pop since Smith did it. Both sides have been totally destroyed by the complete changes of scale. And the Seagram building is very beautifully related to the original brownstones, and the bustle at the back and so on locks it all into the original system. And that, I think, is the problem with us as well. So, one sort of sympathetic and for the idea, and I like the persistence and all that. It's all splendid, you see. I mean, we can't help having a great deal of anxiety about the end product in relation to that place. And the other problem, of course, is the skyline, which is a perfectly exactly like a great number of other buildings in the city. I happen to live in a marvellous skyline myself, in at Whitehall Court, and I look out over the rest of the city, where actually the worst things are invisible are square-cut towers. They are actually dreadful in relation to everything else that was there. And the towers, they would have the meanings and all that sort, have been obscured, and one is stuck with a series of rather lumpy objects, of which the NatWest Tower is probably the last, one hopes, without grace, in what was in fact a spectacular skyline only 15 years ago.
I thought the skyline was gone.
Well, it's gone, but I mean,
this building is not going to make it worse.
What skyline?
Why can't we make it better?
No, but still, which skyline? What's
It was 17th century.
If what you originally had was a sort of 100-foot high level of Victorian land building, and then on top of that there were useless parts, useless buildings. You see, I mean, the top of London University and all that was actually not intended to be occupied. So those were decorative. You see, they were actually decorative objects. Now, your building is fine. It just needs the Chrysler Tower on top.
But it's like saying it shouldn't, only was something else.
No, it isn't. No, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is the relationship of we've surely learnt in 30 years something.
Show me which building has learnt this something.
No.
I think
to learn from what you can see.
Absolutely, and
that's why they can't accept.
The economist is actually slightly better.
Okay, so that's one.
That's one.
So
let's have another.
I mean, there seems to me to be no perfect human being and no perfect scheme, and the Bucklersbury House is undoubtedly a weakness. There's no question about that. And there's nothing that I can do about it. I mean, there's nothing. All one can say, I suppose, is that a building as bad as that must come to the end of its useful life in due course, and that if it is surrounded, if it is then the fourth side of a square which has three very beautiful sides,
one's hope will be that the legal and general who own it and who may still own it then would be obliged to build a fourth beautiful side. But I mean, it's a rather specious argument, isn't it?
That's like a Theo facade.
There's another possibility, isn't there, surely, which is to just simply put a facade on. Exactly. Because this is what would have been done, in fact, in a more comfortable age. It would have been done with a mansion house, which would be considered weak, just as Nash's Buckingham Palace was considered weak, and so Alison would put on the front that you now see, to face the Mall. Somebody would do that, would have done that to the mansion house if your square had been created in tape. And surely we could do that at Bucklersby House. I mean, is there actually anything to stop people from?
Well, only the legal and general. Only the legal and general whose sensibilities may be ruffled because they may take it amiss from somebody like me to come along to them and say, can we reface it or grow ivy up it or do something?
So we couldn't you couldn't allow a 10-foot bay for this.
Was it designed for the legal and general function?
No, it was designed by.
So they can't take.
Four. Was it?
It was designed by. There wasn't. No.
So they wouldn't take offence then.
Well, they might. I don't know what their view would be.
If you allowed a 10-foot bay in front for what you might call a false front, that would be very handy, and it's wide and paved.
I'm sure one can do something. I'm sure one can do something with planting. I mean, Lanning has proposals to have very large-scale trees and so on. But of course, that's only a partial solution and only part of the year.
Is there any possibility of linking the square to any one of those buildings? In other words, closing, I don't know the name of the roads, the road, let us say, to the east?
The road to the east. Well, the road to the. You mean right against the mansion?
Or is it closed?
Well, that actually, that doesn't exist. I mean, that's really
I see.
an indication of a traffic way across the square. But the surface of granite would run right to the.
So it is lengthened straight to the mansion house. Okay, I misread.
It is a
Could you
full
just go over the argument as to why the road didn't go up between 2 and 3 so that the building came down into the mansion
Yes,
house
Mies.
square?
That was Mies's first solution, but it didn't work. I mean, it's a marvellous drawing to see, and it's a much better solution. But it didn't work because the underground complications at this part have to be seen to be believed in terms of the network of sewers, the travelator system, the statutory undertakers. It is a cobweb underground. We have a survey of it. It is a cobweb of complication. And Mies was forced in the end to put his building as far away from that as he possibly could. If he put it farther closer to the mansion house, he would not have been able to thread the columns through the difficulties underground, and particularly the travelator.
And you don't think there's any hope of directing the Queen Victoria Street traffic up Queen Street and so into Cheapside?
That was another solution we thought of. It was another solution we tried out, but the city wouldn't have it. It would be marvellous.
They have it now. I mean, this must be painful to you, but how long ago was that? I mean, as you're coming up against fresh problems, you know.
Well, we reviewed all these questions, of course, with the city before this latest planning application, and the city feel that this solution will create a traffic improvement of about 15% or thereabouts to alleviate the congestion at Bank Junction. I agree with you, it would be much more satisfactory if the building could have its feet on granite and that there could be an uninterrupted space, and that perhaps the road could go behind the building or something, but it's not feasible technically. And what they said about the other possible realignment up Queen Street was that that would create, you alleviate congestion at one point and you create it elsewhere, and it would lead to further complications east of Bank Junction.
When there are fewer cars in 20, 25 years' time, maybe sooner, then perhaps we think more of the traffic of the city.
I was talking to Peter yesterday about the possibility of having a granite Queen Victoria Street in front of the building, between the square and the building, so that one would have some sort of visual identity of between of one material, linking the two buildings across the entire square. But again, the city apparently are against that, or would be against it.
For the horse's hooves.
Yeah, basically.
Well, it's bad for spillage of oil and that sort of thing.
Peter, you said you thought the building had weaknesses. You've mentioned about Butler's Street House as one of them, and the street going right past the front is another. I wonder if you'd just like to enlarge on how you see the strengths and the weaknesses of the building.
Of the building itself?
Yeah,
I think the scheme has weaknesses, and
yes,
those are two of them. I think those are the two most apparent ones of them. I think that the strength of the building, to me, it's perhaps rather impertinent of me to talk in front of you about what I feel about architecture, because I'm really not qualified or capable to talk about it. But to me, the building is very much in tune, or attuned to, the characteristics that I associate with the city. That's to say, it's very classical. It has great order about it. It's very dignified. It's very understated. It's very conservative. And its relationship is very carefully and precisely tailored to the dimensions of the square that it confronts. I don't think, a lot of people say it's very dominating, overwhelming. I don't accept that at all. I think it stands back. It doesn't assert itself. It doesn't say, I am the greatest, look at me. It steps back. It's well mannered. It's reticent, and it acknowledges, in my opinion, the distinguished buildings that surround it as an equal partner. It doesn't set out. I think this word dominate implies some sort of competition, some sort of aggression, which I don't think that the building has. So I think it's a strength. I think myself that the square is a strength. I don't accept the argument that because the city is not a place of squares, that is an argument why there shouldn't be a square. I think it's always a first time. And the question is overcoming a reluctance to actually take that step. In the end, I think it's a balance of advantage. The Victorian buildings there at the moment are quite pleasant, I think. They are well known. They are well loved, especially the Belcher building at the corner, the Map and Web building. But they are really, I mean, inside, I don't know, I know them intimately inside. In fact, I live in one of them. They are really terrible. I mean, they're full of, they're unsafe, they're outworn, they're patched. They are late Victorian buildings. They're out of date, and I think it would be, the ventilation is appalling, the daylighting is appalling. I think that they would be very, very difficult to replan in their triangular shape, which is bad shape anyway. And so I think that one has to weigh the balances, the advantages and disadvantages, and make up one's own mind.
Certainly one of my unforgettable memories of the city is, on a midsummer day, is seeing these armies of people in suits who've got nowhere to go except sweaty old pubs, and they're sort of spilling out onto the pavements, sort of sweating profusely and trying to keep cool, and absolutely nowhere to go at all. I can't understand people who say that we shouldn't have a square in the middle of the city.
I think that's right. I mean, if you give somebody a little bit of open space, a churchyard, for example, it is full of people sitting on the ground, reading a book, sleeping, sketching, eating. I mean, all sorts of very ordinary things, but they're actually doing it on a tiny space. If you give them a beautifully defined space that's well landscaped and well programmed and well maintained above all, then I think it's going to be, I'm sure it's going to be a success.
Well, I think we shouldn't fool ourselves. I mean, I don't think that I think the relation of the mission of Miesian architecture of the square to the building isn't a populist idea. I think we shouldn't over-romanticize this. It's actually primarily a formal idea, which doesn't devaluate it, except if we devaluate it by reinterpreting it into something it isn't really meant to be. I'm all for the people falling out on the square and having their coffee, if there's somewhere to have coffee, and enrich it. But it isn't the key element. I don't think that the square in front of the sea room is a populous space. It's a breathing space, if you like. It's a space where occasionally you see someone sitting on the steps on certain hot days. But it is actually a visual space, and we must be a bit careful about that statement. I think it is not meant to be the corner cafe square.
Well, people often, I mean, the city architect, for example, said to me, we don't like this, we don't want it. We have two, we have two direct precedents for this. We have Paternoster and we have the Commercial Union, and they are both disasters, and we don't want a third.
Here's Paternoster, sorry.
Well, Ransom Hall.
Oh, right, sorry. Yes.
But they are totally different.
Well, they're quite different.
Absolutely different.
They're quite different, and what I'm trying to do is to say that because we are in the centre of the city, in the very heart of it, that it must be inescapably peopled.
Yes, the CU one is slightly closer. I'm against the CU square, and I'm not that happy about squares in the city. In the sense that I do think it's a relief to have something that is different. I'm actually beginning to feel, in the sense of the city, that there's also something to be said. I'm not quite so convinced as I used to be about having people living there beyond 6 o'clock, but that's another, in the sense that it's great to have somewhere which is different and works rather well. But having said that, that isn't against, I mean, it's too difficult to be terribly broad, but one can put up an argument for saying the city is one of the more unique places because people do not live in it. It is actually, and certainly Wall Street is a unique place because people don't, to take an example, live in it. It works very well between 9 and 7 o'clock. And that, I think that can be an approach. I think you can also argue that a space in front of the building is a continuation of that building, and there are different types of spaces. There are the spaces which I personally am interested in, which tend to be populous spaces, but it doesn't stop one saying there are also spaces which are great to view a building from, which are not populous, but are just spatial.
You don't see, Richard, a sort of analogy with Beauvoir, where I was last weekend, and we spent a long time.
I love the square. I love it even more.
You don't see a lot of activities going on there.
But I don't see. Oh, I mean, they may happen because you
don't see mime.
Architects don't control it too much, but no, not really, because there's a lot of road, and there are not enough activities either at ground level to actually encourage it. I mean, the formality of the Miesian entrance is such that you have to take it on axes. You can't slip in through sideways.
But I'm saying, Richard, you think the square should be more formal.
No, I prefer to be linked, but I mean, I think it is a formal statement. I mean, it's not a negative point. I'm trying to make it a positive point. I'm saying, there's Siena and there's Beaubourg, but there's also San Marco in the winter. There are many a square in Italy, going back to Italy, but which is great with its horse standing in the middle. It doesn't always have to be full of people. That is what is bad is when it doesn't do one or the other. But in this situation, Mies hasn't spent a lot of time perfecting what I would call a moderately empty square.
I think there's one thing really missing. Where's the obligatory hymn and work?
It's probably in that curve.
I think another aspect which we haven't mentioned is the civic aspect as well. One of my memories of Chicago, one of my fondest memories of Chicago was when I went back there, long after I used to work there, and I went back totally by accident at exactly the moment when they were unveiling the Chagall Memorial in the First National Bank Plaza. And it was about 11 in the morning, and the plaza was packed full of people. And it wasn't just architects or artists or middle-class people. I was standing next to a bunch of construction workers, who couldn't understand the French slogans on the banners. And I thought at that time that this couldn't possibly happen to London, in London, because there isn't anywhere in London where that sort of thing could happen. But it may be that something like that might be able to happen in a place like this. I don't know.
Well, I think Robin, you'd have to have. I mean, what you're saying, I don't think it could happen in London, not because there isn't a space, but because there isn't the awareness.
And also because there isn't the right space. You see, I mean, I don't know all the buildings, but the bottom of the mansion house isn't a natural place to have, there are no cafes at the bottom of the side of the mansion. The something illegal, general illegal, what a name, no wonder it has a building like that. Anyhow, whatever it is, general legal, legal and general, legal and general, okay, legal and general. I mean, it doesn't sort of encourage sort of beggars, or musicians, or people that have sandwiches. And Mises building itself, in a sense, doesn't, not in a sense, there's no pressure, it doesn't encourage it. You don't lean against glass comfortably, nor about the formality of the stair. It isn't something that's negative, it's something, and it may be, one's totally wrong, and there will be, all you need is a couple of accidental things to happen. Of course, it may generate it, but I don't think that's the aim of it. And you can't.
The interesting thing, I think, has been the two exhibitions we've had, 1968 and just the week before last. I mean, the really fascinating comments have come not from the stock jobbers in their top hats and rolled umbrellas, but from teenagers coming in jeans and t-shirts and saying, "Build it. This is great."
I think it'd be terrific standard there, but if it was really going to be a space for the public, I think the first thing I'd do is dig a hole there practically at this point. I mean, because you've already lost all the edges. The edges are lost to the people who are using it at that level. If we then say, right, my aim in life, and I don't think it should be, but if the aim was, this very common humanist aim, of creating a series of cafe life, pub life, then maybe the only thing to do would be to remove from your shopping mall, which is below, the roof, and create a sort of a hole around, and a new series of buildings around the edge of this hole. I'm not sure if you follow what I'm saying, which could then relate to the city populist element. But that's not what was certainly the plan of Mises, and I would be dubious whether I would be for it, because it seems to me let's get one thing right first and then let's move to the next one. There are lots of other places in London where we can start to work on that one.
John, you were...
Yeah, well, Richard, some of them went on more or less to say it. Well, it was just that, I mean, I know that in the day the Mansion House Square would be packed because it is ready. And that's not going to change or stop. And as there is actually nowhere to sit down at all, for a heck of a radius, and there are an awful lot of people who would quite like to, like lunchtime. And the facilities for lunch, I mean, actually are local and available. But I would like to be at Mansion House Square, like I often love to be in the city. One of the marvellous things about the city is its emptiness and its quietness and night and weekend. I mean, I don't, like my son, have steel caps on my sneakers. He does because they sound good. And I'd love to walk in Jasper's sneakers across that ground at night alone and listen and see. I mean, so in other words, I think a public space can have quality in a totally quiet. I mean, Richard did it all with his horse in the Italian square, because it's exactly what I mean.
The Capitol is best.
And lovely.
Empty.
No traffic.
But it's empty. The Capitol with a horse, sorry. I mean, you don't go to the Capitol in Rome to see the people. You get to see the view and the horse, that was there.
There's a beautiful sitting square at Marble Arch, but to get there you have to kill yourself.
Yes,
right. Going round you. So this has terrific swirling traffic coming up from Victoria Street and along Poetry. That's what bothers me.
On two sides it does, doesn't it?
Yes.
You can get to it.
No, but the other side there's traffic also where it says Bucklersbury.
Not much, actually.
No. And then what's this down the side?
It'll have
of the
traffic on
Mansion
three
House?
sides.
What is this line down the...
Well, that's purely for Mansion House ceremonial, and it's purely for servicing, maintaining the Mansion House. It's a granite indentation, is what it is. And the traffic there will be a lot of traffic around two sides of the square, and a smaller amount of traffic round to the south and down Walbrook, which will become essentially a service road. But
I mean, to make that a nice square, Landing Roper ought to sort of build it up there, but then that would cut off the lease, so that's no good.
You mean raise the level of it? You mean?
Well, or put a sort of barricade of bushes or something all the way around that side. But you can't, you know, since it's supposed to link in with Nice and the Nice to Mansion House, you can't do that. It's got to remain flat. Have all the traffic in the petrol fields and all. The lead.
it's sad that most London squares do, you see. I mean, Trafalgar Square and Grosvenor Square and St James's Square and most squares one thinks of. Leicester Square is a bad example. Most have traffic rolling all around them, don't they?
But in some ways, aren't wheels necessarily part of urban life?
They're not in squares.
No, they're not in
squares.
squares. Absolutely not.
I mean,
No.
roundabouts are not natural for wheels, but not, then you shouldn't call them a square.
Yes,
They're
but
roundabouts.
what they've done to Leicester Square might easily get done once they found they've got the square and begun.
Well, that would be the hope.
I hope they do it better.
That would be the hope.
The reason I mentioned about the first National Bank Plaza in Chicago is because to illustrate the point that I think Chicagoans have a great pride in their city, probably as a result of the fact that they've had a great many world-class 20th century buildings. Well, London doesn't have as far as I'm concerned, doesn't have a world-class 20th century building yet, and this may be a reason why Londoners don't have very much pride in their city. But maybe if we did have, a marvellous building right in the middle of the city, Londoners might begin to have some sort of pride in the city where they work, and this might actually generate some sort of.
My comment on that. I mean, I'm trying to work out what's worrying me, and I think that it is this feeling of the museum quality of the object, which is sort of going around the room. Some kind of artifact that's been sort of found. Why can't we have one? Sort of feeling. We've got the Seagram building in New York. I certainly agree it's one of the greatest buildings there, undoubtedly. I don't personally feel the need, that I don't go along with this idea that we ought to have one too, sort of thing. It's an almost replica building, in a way. There's a sort of feeling of, taking something out of a museum, removing it from the past and putting it there. And it worries me, I must say, especially to hear Richard talking about it in the way he was after holding forth last week at some length, or 3 weeks ago it was, about the richness and quality and texture of buildings in the city, and showing views of his model, of his Lloyd's building, from many different angles, which seem to show it fitting in with the city so well, both in sort of bulk from a distance, and also in the streetscape. And he was at some pains to show it sort of, stepping around the street and following the grain of the street. I don't think anyone could claim this building sort of fitted in any kind of way, whatever, with the kind of grain of the city. And I don't think anyone here would. That it nevertheless is a obviously something which we would all like to look at, and it's easier to look at it here than go over to New York. But I must say I don't feel people are being very honest about the whole thing myself.
But you're talking about the grain of the city, I think, in plain terms. And one of the things that, again worries me about Richard Lloyd's building, and he's going to prove me wrong in a few years' time, is that, in a sense, it is based on the visual feeling of the city, the picturesque tradition of the city that you see each view as you go round it. And nowhere in the city have we got a high building, one of the new high buildings related to a space
that is in any way simple and totally coherent. Now, this is true of all the buildings that have gone up so far, that we have destroyed that grain in 3 dimensions and tried to kid ourselves in 2 dimensions on doing it all. Here we have a marvellous opportunity in a very simple space, the great weakness of the road, and surely we can get Queen Victoria Street rerouted, can't we? Quite soon, I would have thought. And an opportunity to build a high building that's simple in concept and rich in detail. And that's a marvellous opportunity now, because all the high buildings we've had, initially they were an act of faith that they were going to be like Meese and they didn't turn out to be. Here we have a marvellous opportunity. We actually know that it is going to be rich in detail. And so we have a building related to a space, something that is new in the city, and something that's not related to this older picturesque tradition, so that we've gone into play between the 2 things. And I don't think we should be worried about that at all.
I don't accept, you see, that it is like the Seagram building. I mean, apart from the fact that the module is quite different, the only common, it's much purer than the Seagram building to start with. The Seagram building is a very incredibly beautiful building, but it's not very pure. I mean, it has all sorts of things happening at the back.
The bustle.
Yes, the bustle at the back. This is much different. This is much purer, if you like. And I think the only thing it has in common with Seagram is the use of the materials, extruded bronze and marble and travertine. But I agree with you about this question of the museum quality of the thing in the context of the square as a whole. I mean, that is a charge, and a perfectly arguable a charge levelled against development. Why do we need to have a sort of art historical progression chronologically, starting with the Church of St. Stephen, Walbrook, and going round? This is going to make the thing rather sterile, rather academic, which is why I come back to an attempt to get over that by humanising the spaces in between and producing something which has life and character and gets right away from any kind of sterility, any kind of academic characteristic.
But Nick, you raised an interesting thing. I mean, because what you just said, one would suppose then that it's never possible, in fact, to build a building in the city other than one which immediately fits in with its context.
The buildings, the city is absolutely full of buildings which are not in the vein of the city. It's keeping in the vein. I mean, the city has been wrecked in that sense.
Yeah, but throughout history, it's not just in London. I mean, it goes back to Rome, Florence.
The Bank of England started breaking the vein. The same building.
Depends upon the quality and the value of that.
Yes, it does. And I mean, I think that I think the difficulty is the exact sort of scale of it in relation to its surroundings. I'm certainly, personally, I mean, I'm in favour of the square and that side of it and the urban side. I think I'm also rather against office blocks altogether, in a way, in the sense of I think that there's a lot of thinking going into it. I mean, the whole atrium business and the way you look into spaces, and the way office workers live and what they do and so on is under a lot of consideration now. And I also feel that this type of building possibly is a fossilization of a marvellous sort of financial concept of net to gross floor area and circulation and I mean there's nothing sort of new there, whatever, in thinking to it.
It's 170 million square feet, 175 million square feet of office space in London. I think we should be able to afford a little bit of that for this building. I mean, I such a point to make it, but you're doing it different.
Richard, I suggest the week in between your last meeting and now.
You were there?
3 weeks, was it?
You've recovered your historical perspective. There's a very long tradition in architecture, building the main buildings.
after their architects were dead. That is, if you exclude the dome of Florence Cathedral, the Foundling Hospital, San Spirito, the thing in San Lorenzo, everything that we take as an absolutely basic standard of aspiration for the architecture of post-Gothic period was done from models. That is, there were 2 columns erected of San Lorenzo during the rest of his lifetime. And the quality of, in spite of whatever his biographers say, the quality exists in the building that was consequent to the thought that was put into it, even though it was executed by somebody else. And it seems to me that if you have the possibility of getting a police building known, like they put a core building in Cambridge, Massachusetts, it would be absolutely stupid to turn it up. You know, it's like saying, we won't have the Patsy Chapel because he's not alive anymore. You know, it's an absurd concept. That is, the fact that the thing is finished 2 generations after it's originated has got absolutely no meaning in architecture. That is, and certainly as far as urbanism is concerned, no urbanism is ever achieved in its originator's lifetime. That is, the plan for Washington, after all, was just a bit after George Washington, as it was. But in fact, it only reached anything like its notional idea in the post-war period, because the trees were not planted until the 30s of this century. You know, therefore, Washington didn't become Washington as envisaged, and something like a 200-year interval elapsed. But nevertheless, Washington looks marvelous in spite of its architecture, because it's sustained by a notion of street and tree. You know, and that the interval doesn't seem to me to have destroyed the pleasure or the kind of indescribable sense of breathing more deeply, consequent of something being marvelous. And Alison and I went back this Christmas to look at the Carpenter Centre, and the older you get, the more you realise it was a melange between Julian and the Corbusier. That's the combination of the 2 generations of talent, and the more there is in it to learn about, exactly as there is in the founding hospital. You know, the older you get, the more there is to learn. And with any luck, Mies building now, any building by late architects, is always the combination of his generation and the generation who are building it. That is, it's an inescapable connection. And it has 3 things and 2 generations in it already, because he was working with younger architects when it was designed, and it's going to be realised by younger architects. Therefore, there's absolutely no doubt that the presidents for doing this, both in the early Renaissance and in our own lifetime, prove that it works. I mean, the only thing that has to be done is that with Mies, it seems to me, the space outside in the building should be adjacent to one another. That is, that Queen Victoria Street has got to be bent to the right and then up or something, so that there's a piece of territory. Because in terms of the history of high buildings, you could say the only thing that's happened since Mies has been the kind of forward bustle thing. That is, in climates of more harshness than ours, that is North America, particularly Canada, that the format in which the building springs out at the front, so that the piazza is part of the building, covered, like the Cortile was part of the Palazzo. That is the only thing that's happened since Mies died, is that. And it hasn't actually reached an apotheosis, that form. It's in a prototype of form, because it's been done by indifferently good architects. So there's nothing, one need not fear that there's anything more modern. I mean, they've just got to bloody well build it. and within the next 5 years. Do you now own enough of the site to actually build it?
The only bit of the site I don't own is is number 1 Queen Victoria Street.
Where is that?
And where is that?
And that is where the...
It belongs to the city.
It belongs to the city corporation. This is the key to the whole development.
The city goes with it.
And it is the National Safe Deposit Building at the south east corner of the square, where there is the bandstand surrounded by trees on the site plan.
But and they won't let you get on with it until they've given.
Well, if we get planning permission, then the corporation will, I think, sell it to us. If we do not get planning permission, then the corporation is bound either to sell the freehold to the occupants, which is the Bank of New Zealand. The Bank of New Zealand is a powerful institution because it's the National Bank of New Zealand, and therefore has a good deal of political muscle. Or it would give the Bank of New Zealand an extension of its lease, which expires in 1986. In either case, it would frustrate Mansion House Square, because it's bang in the middle of the square, and we couldn't give effect to it. And so, what I've said to the city is, please sit on the fence. I mean, ideal is sell the building to me now, and don't sell it to the Bank of New Zealand, because for the simple reason that I can pay you a better price for it, because I'm the developer. And you must have some, you must give some weight to that argument, because it's taxpayers' money and so on. I can give you a much better price than the bank can. But if you're prepared to sit on the fence in the alternative and wait for the outcome of this planning application, and then, when it's been determined, if it's determined in our favour, sell it to me, and we can give effect to the development. Or if it's not, then you can do what you like with the Bank of New Zealand.
So
and I think
what sort of time scale is that?
the time scale is dependent on what happens next. What will happen, I believe, is a public inquiry. And I don't know, Richard's much better person to talk about public inquiries than I am, which is where we came in. But I would have thought that I mean, one hopes ideally that
one
if
chap we don't want to employ.
But it's true to say, isn't it, that I mean,
the public inquiry will last 250 years.
but if everything went according to plan, Peter, when could it?
If everything goes according to plan, we have the public inquiry in September, and there is a determination by this time next year, then the building would be built at the beginning of 1987, on the 1st of January, and it would be up by 1990.
It probably, if I can, it brings me to the question you were asking at the beginning. I mean, first of all, let me say, I don't think, just to start with the next question there first. I mean, I don't know it's not a museum, because after all, people want to work in offices. I don't actually believe that the microchip will suddenly make us all free of offices. Actually, I think it will do exactly the reverse. It may take us out much more from light industry into offices, but anyhow, that's another discussion. And I don't feel that that the building will stay empty, which means, I suppose, that people will vote with their feet. They will use the building, proving the fact that it is necessary. It's more to the point that I feel is the fact that I think it will be an unbelievable battle, as Peter knows, to get it through, and that is the nature which is the question we were asking before, and that is, how does one get any form of building which, with the exception of very common economists, I can't think of one, which has actually been built anywhere near, and I don't know the history of it, the plans that it was originally built, and anywhere near the period, during near a reasonable period for the building of that building. In this situation here, I suspect that it's our own professional which will probably end up by putting a knife in its back. I hope it won't, but I think there's a very good chance. I would be intrigued, and I know I can't ask the question, I'd be intrigued to know what all our many protective societies, including the Royal Fine Arts, I have a pretty good idea what they will say. I would guess what they will say. Sorry, Sherlock, you didn't have to answer that.
Yes, but when you say you don't know of any building, what you mean is you don't know of any quality building.
I don't know of any
quality.
Oh, absolutely. I'm sorry. I don't know. Absolutely. Okay. When I talk about building, I mean quality. I mean quality. I don't mean shit. Absolutely. And I think that we will. I mean, the vibe I have from the city is that it's too dangerous. It's dynamite. So it's okay to do how many ever stories seafood building to take Alison's point. But this one is dynamite. Someone's going to actually have to come out prone, and that
is why I want to get it as fast as I can to the minister.
But the minister,
I mean, if he will, well, I'm happy to take my chance at public inquiry. If I have to choose between the city and the GLC on one hand, and the minister on the other, I'll take my chance with the minister.
I had the misfortune at lunch, sitting next to Simon Jenkins, who advises the minister. And my God. I mean, whilst the minister is advised by Simon Jenkins of this way, the thing can get up, and that will be built, and there are other advisors, but it is an intriguing situation. And together with that, with Simon was most of our profession at our IBA, and I agree that isn't, I'm not talking about whether that's the quality of the profession, but it goes for most of the people who are there. And the argument at a sort of, round the table that went on this type of level about this building was pathetic. I mean, it was at the level of, well, we've had towers, or well, it's out of date, or well,
you know. Charlie on your left.
Well,
Richard at the back.
Can I just say I come from another sort of very late working session with Norman Foster, and he asked me to say something, which was that when you were in the situation where the sort of pundits leap on a thing like the mist building, crack it apart and they check the whole thing sort of as sort of fodder for the papers, and they leave alone all the sort of rubbish and dreadful stuff that gets built. I mean, that's his point. But you must. It's great.
Yes, but what can you do about it except have it called in? I mean, not let it go not let it go to the city at all.
Well,
manoeuvre it so that
it's got to.
minister calls it in.
Yes, well, that's exactly what I'm trying to do. You see, it has to.
And there'd be no appeal. I mean, there wouldn't be a public appeal. He would call it in and decide.
He would call it.
Is this a process that can be accelerated? I mean,
you could probably take the top 2 stories off. The pieces seem to be populist.
the question, but then you put the architect puts them back again. Once you get started, they'd never take action to make it 2 stories off again. Never happen. Never happen.
As far as I can assess, Coin Street is about whether we shall or should not take 1 story off one building out of the 8 beams of it. That's basically what it's really about.
What is it about London?
And that's 3. I mean, we're very talking about it for 3 years, and I think the minister. I mean, God knows you can't interpret it, but the general feeling is that he'll probably give us permission as long as we take that story off. I mean, it's
I just want to know what is it about London or England, London mainly, why quality should attract so much criticism, where mediocrity doesn't seem to attract any criticism whatsoever. What is it that causes that?
I think it's much it really is too difficult a question to answer, because it is patently so.
This is the whole root of the problem.
The plan has changed gear.
The plan
has changed gear to deal with that problem. That's quite simple.
I mean,
talking about my plan.
Yeah, they then take your standards.
Can we have one? I mean, yes. I mean, it's anything that draws extreme attention.
No, it's to do with the way you approach a subject. For instance, if you go and talk to a planner, and next to you is a builder who is actually getting his urban health passed, the planner will talk to the builder in his language, very reasonable, see. And he will explain, well, you've got to colour the other way a bit, and you've got to cross the windows and so on. And then Mr. FRIBA turns up with his thing, see. And this bloke immediately starts talking about Raphael and Michelangelo. It's a completely different way. I mean, it's another world, really. And so, it's like a perfectly clever girl who is talking good English in selling the flowers in the Mayfair shop, and goes home and talks Cockney in the East End. I mean, it's exactly how the world is.
No,
it's a reality.
No, I don't think so. Do you think that people get what they want?
Yes, everybody.
I mean,
gets exactly what
politically,
Guess what is safe?
I mean, do you think that? Do you think?
You get what you need.
I mean, I've got this feeling that the Italians wanted Mussolini, the Germans wanted Hitler. It went much too far, of course, and that we want certain political things, and that we get essentially what we want. And the British don't want architecture because there isn't that awareness that Robin was talking about, where you get construction workers on a plaza who are interested and keen in Chicago. There isn't that awareness, and the question, I think, is how one can generate some sort of awareness.
But I think you would. I mean, if there was a ceremony, suppose it was there and there's something was coming on the square, the first band or whatever, you'd get construction workers.
Yes,
I'm sure the resistance isn't there. It's this business that, for some reason, planners feel it absolutely necessary to knock quality whenever they see it.
It's not only that, it's the press surely as well. It's the media that immediately pick up on any name that is well known. Either it's an architect or it's
but only if
somebody
you've been
involved
primed by somebody. I mean, we've always had very decent press coverage on ordinary press, you know. Yes. I mean, it's just if somebody primes them first, then you know, somebody
Yes, still, Alison, I have vivid memories of brutalism and other elements which I had.
Yes, but what I mean is when you're doing something, you know, out of press.
If you put in for just a glass building developed by you and never mentioned the name Least, you might have sailed through.
I think the argument is not going to
That is seafood, you mean?
The argument is not going to
But
be
if you
about
put it
policy.
under the
That's
name
the sad thing.
Palumbo, they might have thought it was Christopher. It would have been a terrible scandal.
Sure, I would like to ask a question, by the way, which is, I think there is, you say, you said it eloquently, the whole fact that it's not important if buildings are built, in fact most buildings, and I had tried to say it before, which one can think of the Renaissance, many of the people were built after the architects had died. Yet, there is certainly a certain point when the validity is no longer such that one should build. In other words, one is not rushing around at the moment looking for old designs by Brunelleschi to rebuild. There is a lack of validity. So there is a certain time, a certain moment within the...
Well, this is why I was asking about the time. Obviously, the timescale question was not an academic or business one. It was precisely to answer Richard's question in advance. That was the buildings, the Renaissance buildings, were built by, almost certainly by the pupils or master masons of the original architect. That is, that the longer you leave it, the worse things get. Because the technology will have moved away, which is what Richard said, and the kind of architecture is not an intellectual craft, it's a trade. And what we've learned is from each other by master-pupil relationship. When that's snapped by the skipping of a generation, it can't be restored. Therefore, the building can be built if a model or drawings exist and the people are there who can remember why the decisions were made, and the emotional climate of the decision, and the technology of this. You can't build her unless you know, because none of those factors apply. The technology is not there. The stone can't be got. The
I think it's the spirit in it, isn't it? It's really the spirit, because we could do it.
Spirit,
the spirit, the Zittigeist.
Can you imagine them setting out to do it? Because they produce a kind of academic copy,
yes,
which is a different game. You know.
But it's the spirit that's gone to. There's a certain point, it seems to me, that where there is actually, it's not so much. I mean, I'd like to believe it's just the technology, but it suits my arguments. But I think it's actually a certain period where the spirit goes. That spirit is probably linked, as you say rightly, to the people who carry it out. If it is the people who work in that office, if you like, in that studio, then that spirit still exists and one feels sufficient confidence. But there's a certain point when the confidence totally evaporates because it seems so far away. There's no longer the validity is lost.
You see, and if you're someone from the office, you have the nerve to change it. If it's a successive generation, you stick to the drawing.
Yeah.
And now that's when it died. It must be built.
You see, I'm very lucky because I've got Mrs. Eyre, as it were, and Peter Carter, and through him, through Dennis and Adie.
But Adie's got white hair already. Not to move this.
I cultivate it.
Adie's got white hair, but no, he hasn't got a beard. Peter's got the beard. And
but Shaban, you said it won't be turned down on quality.
I speak without feeling here because I've just been giving evidence in the public inquiry on exactly the subject. I've been trying to put to the inspector why a certain development was a development of quality by Ted Cullinan, actually. And it got absolutely nowhere. The arguments finally that won were planning ones, if you like, broadly speaking, conservation and planning ones. They just weren't interested in the quality side. I mean, I don't think they understood. It's extremely difficult to put across anyhow, the quality argument. And what's going to determine this ultimately? I mean, I don't say that the Secretary of State won't overrule an inspector's report, but what the arguments are going to affect the inspector's decision are going to be listed buildings and their loss, a high building in that position. I mean, there's going to be a big argument about high buildings ought to be kept east of the Mansion House and there shouldn't be any to the west of the Mansion House. Possibly a certain amount about the exposure of the buildings and that the Mansion House west elevation is not good enough, but I'm not sure about that. That's rather a weak argument on the hill. But those are the sort of arguments I think that I'm afraid are going to really dominate the public inquiry.
Would they be keen about the public square?
Well, yes, the formation. I mean, the whole historical aspect of forming a public square and that it's not in keeping with the city pattern and all that will come out of that. You'll get historian after historian. Conservation is saying a square is not in the nature of the city.
I must say that
I'm afraid.
They're all poor historically, aren't they? Because there wasn't any Covent Garden before there wasn't any square in London before that. Someone had each
you get all these people very vociferous and producing what apparently sound very convincing arguments. The inspectors get influenced by them.
I have to understand history. I mean, the intriguing part about this one is that you do have to have an historical understanding, because just to agree with one point with Nick, and that is that if that plan on its own is produced by a 50th student, I don't think you'd get his thesis. I don't. Would you agree?
Good point.
Because after all, it breaks, and there's all kinds of views. I shan't go through. No relation between building and space. There's no, and in the sense of the road cutting through it. It's yet one more tower. It breaks the skyline. It's not the skyline. If towers are built, they should be like asparaguses used for the Johnson's thing. There should be a relationship to something else, and all this. And so therefore, you fall back upon historical knowledge of knowing what a Mies building is. and that's what you're throwing back upon which the inspector, the inquiry, and the minister will not have a...
No.
I think on the other hand,
You very rarely meet, I've never met anybody who dislikes Edinburgh.
But they have...
Well, very few people see it.
Not many people see it.
Not many people see it.
Yes, they were. I mean, every time we mention a foreign building at our inquiry, they sort of practically put us down as traitors to the country.
I think you do have a good case, actually, in terms of the plan, in that the relationship of the Midlands Bank and the Mansion House to the square would be very beautiful. There's something really positive there. And the southeast corner with the tower actually fills it very nicely. I mean, the only thing that would be horrid in the square is actually the Buckinghamshire House facade, which is no fault of yours. So, if you were going to play the argument at an inquiry, I mean, I think one would really turn the thing on. If I was going to play it before, one would turn it on the conservationists and point out that actually you were providing a setting for two excellent buildings and make the point of it and do some research on those buildings. You see, because it's like the Gulbenkian collection in Lisbon. It's not really good art, but they make a great point of researching every item so that they become precious.
Unless there's a burning, somebody has something. I can hear the rumbles of hunger. It's well past 9. I would just I mean, Peter Palumbo has been given a lot of advice, which he didn't actually ask for. And I would just, I mean, I think that there's clearly, there's a tide, I think, I mean, running in the room. I mean, what I am certain about, that I do think that we all wish that we had clients like Peter Palumbo. And I mean, the kind of, I mean, the dedication of purpose that he's shown to this. And I just think I would like to thank you very much on your behalf for coming to share his story with us tonight. Thank you very much. Thank you.